Hello and welcome to Lesson 5. This week we're going to talk about, in Chapter 10, planning risk mitigation throughout your organization. And in Chapter 11, we're going to talk about turning your risk assessment into risk mitigation plan. But before we get started, I would like to go over a couple of things. As you can see, Lesson 5, developing a risk management plan outline for an IT infrastructure. That's basically what your labs are going to be on. But as you can see, this week you have your Lesson 5 PowerPoints that we're about to go over. And then you have the Lab 5 Nmap and Nets and Scan report. And so you can download these files here and look at the Nets and Scan reports, and your lab assessment will ask you questions from there. That is one place to download it. But also in Lab 5 Assessment Worksheet Assignment, you also have your worksheet that you download. You also have the actual lab that you download. And then you have the Nessus Vulnerability Scan Report and the Nmap Scan Report. Now, one thing that I want to go over, because many of you are only turning in one document on your assignments each week. As you can see here, if the deliverable calls for a lab report file, you will need to create a lab report file using Microsoft Word or Microsoft PDF, or a PDF document of some type that's compatible. Going forward from this week on, if you only submit the assessment file, you'll only get 50 points out of 100. So basically, in this lab, you have two deliverables. One is the lab report. And so you follow the instructions on the lab, that the lab report, what it tells you to create and what information that it wants, you'll create a Word document for that. Also, the lab assessment worksheet file, those are basically fill in the blanks, and it's going to ask you about your Lab 5. That's self-explanatory. So you will basically download the lab file and the lab assessment. You will complete those documents, create your lab report, and then your lab assessment worksheet, and you will browse and select one document, and then you will browse and select the other document to turn in, and then you would hit the submit button. So I know many of you are turning in your documents, and the PDF file that's a fillable PDF does not show in Blackboard. Do not email me your files because you don't see it. I don't see it either in the Blackboard preview, but what I do see when I download is your original document, and I do see the answers. But if there's for some reason that it's blank in both cases, I will send you a personal email asking you to resend those to my email. With almost 90 students, it'll be hard to keep up with email. And especially when Blackboard is there, it lets me know that it needs to be graded. So we've got also in your Lab 6, because you'll have two labs this week. You have Lab 5 and you have Lab 6. And again, you'll have two deliverables. You have your lab, and then you have your lab worksheet. And then, of course, you have your quiz for the week. And that's based on Lesson 5 and 6 assessment, which is Chapters 9 and 10, respectively. So the assessment comes directly from the labs, and it also comes from the reading and from the PowerPoint. So the answer should be there. It's open book. You're always welcome to use your book and other resources. Only thing I ask is that you don't use each other, because I want you to learn this stuff and not have to pull answers from somebody else. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started here, where all right, bear with me one moment, and we'll get started. Okay, so basically we're going to, in lesson 5, there are strategies for mitigating risk. And, basically the objectives for this week is going to be to describe the concepts of planning, risk, mitigation throughout an organization. And then we're going to be able, you should be able to describe, once we're done with this, concepts of implementing a risk management plan, risk mitigation plan. So our key concepts for the week would be to identify the scope of a risk management plan, best practices for planning risk mitigation, ways to prioritize risk management requirements, develop an organizational risk mitigation plan, and best practices for implementing a risk mitigation plan. So we'll get started with Chapter 10, Planning Risk Mitigation Throughout Your Organization. So where should your organization start with risk mitigation? Well, one, you want to identify your assets. This goes from high, medium, and low. Obviously, a copy machine is probably going to be on the low end, especially if it's network, printer. That'll probably be a low risk unless you have an SNMP patch that hadn't been applied and it's wide open, and it would allow hackers into your organization or give them access to your network. But your high, medium, and low, you want to identify your assets, based on the importance. And a lot of times you want to ask your management what they deem the most important, and then you can start identifying the assets they deem important, and then what's left over you need to identify that, especially those assets that they identify, you will need to see what those connect to. And so you can always put the high, medium, low on that. You want to identify and analyze threats and vulnerabilities. That's an important task. And 3, you want to evaluate the controls to determine what controls to implement. So the scope of a risk management plan involves critical business operations, customer service delivery, mission-critical business systems, applications, and data access, 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, and information system security gap. So the critical business operations, if you work in an organization currently while going to school, you'll know that there's some critical business operations that need to be identified. And so if you work for company XYZ and you guys are developing widgets that go on the space shuttle, and the space shuttle is getting ready to launch in 6 months, and they need that specific widget, that is a critical business operation that you have to get that widget out the door. What processes from start to finish would stop you from from manufacturing and shipping that widget? So you need to, basically you want to identify those critical operations. I can remember as an information assurance manager for the DoD, for the tactical systems that we had, there were several critical operations that would shut the system down. And so we had to identify those first and foremost, and then everything else just sort of fell into place. But once you take care of the critical business operations, then everything else, like I say, will take care of itself. Customer service delivery, that sort of speaks for itself. Mission critical business systems, applications, and data access, that's self-explanatory as well. And here's our old pal, 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. We've had several labs now, especially from the very start. From the first lecture, I mentioned to you that you needed to definitely know the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, because we would see this throughout the semester. And I believe this to be very crucial to know these. So if you don't know the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, I'm not asking you to memorize them, but at least have like certain vulnerabilities and certain patches and whatnot that would fall into what category. Does it fall into the workstation domain, the user domain? Is it the LAN WAN? Is it the remote access? Is it the WAN? There's so many there that, and some vulnerabilities can cross over and happen in multiple domains, but many of the domains have specific vulnerabilities that need to be identified and how hackers can access your infrastructure. So you want to be able to mitigate that up front. So go back to chapter 1, look at the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. And if you want to go back to your labs, many of you missed the second problem that said, okay, what's the most vulnerabilities from each one? I marked in red what the correct answer should be, and you can see the points that were deducted. So if you go back to lab 1 and pull up those remarks, you'll see how many vulnerabilities were listed on there, and so you can go back to your lab worksheet and look, or even in the book I think it lists which vulnerabilities were what, and you can count each one according to its domain. And so that's how you would basically the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. You will continue to see that throughout your if you're working cybersecurity or information assurance, you'll always see this. And for this class purposes, I would recommend you go back to chapter 1 and basically reemphasize and relearn, or refamiliarize yourself with the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure, because this is not the end of it. You will see it more and more and more. And so the information system security gap. Wow, what can I say about that one? There's a lot of people now, if you finance a new car, they'll offer you what they call gap insurance. So for instance, if usually if you buy a brand new car, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because my wife is in the market for a new car, and so I'm doing a lot of this research. And so insurance companies have this gap insurance, and so basically what it does is if you buy a new car, you drive it off the lot, the car depreciates substantially. And so if you wreck that car, will the insurance company replace your car with another brand new one? And so the more gap insurance that you buy will determine how the insurance company, or even the mortgage company, will actually determine what the gap is and make up that gap to replace you with a new vehicle. Well, similarly, with a gap insurance, the information system security gap, works in a similar way. So, basically in chapter 10, let me back up a step. In figure 10.4 in your textbook, I think it's page 259, mentioning that it shows basically the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. It's the same picture as you saw in the first chapter. So basically, the user domain, for instance, every organization has users, obviously. Computers by themselves do a lot, but they can't yet do everything. Instead, the computers are here to support the users, to make the user's job easier, and hopefully speed up the production and productivity of the workforce. But that doesn't always happen. So So basically, the system security gap. The information system security gap refers to the difference between the controls you have in place and what you need. In a perfect world, the commercial with Walgreens, if this were a perfect world, it would be Walgreens. But in a perfect world, the in-place controls will address all threats and vulnerabilities. However, threats and vulnerabilities are constantly changing. A risk assessment provides a point-in-time report. We mentioned this in previous chapters where a risk assessment is only a snapshot. And so, but you have to take that snapshot at some point to get started with your risk management plan. So it can be used to compare the existing threats and vulnerabilities against the in-place controls. Even if the last risk assessment was perfect, it wasn't able to address the threats and vulnerabilities that emerged after the risk assessment. So basically, gap analysis reports are often used when dealing with legal compliance. So for example, you can use a gap analysis report when reviewing compliance with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which is HIPAA, or the Sarbanes-Oxley, known as SOX. The gap analysis report documents the security gap. You should combine the gap analysis report with a remediation plan. The remediation plan identifies how the security gap is closed. In other words, it provides recommendations on what controls to implement. And so one of the risk assessments that you can have, and I don't know, some of you may know this or may not know this, but the NSA came up years ago, many moons ago, called Defense in Depth. It's a multi-layer security assessment. So, for instance, like instead of having a password, you'd have a password, and you'd have a CAC card to go with it, or a chip reader, something multi-level to make sure you are who you are. That's one particular. Firewalls and spam filters and all that stuff. So defense in depth is multi-layer. So basically, let's look at this. Even if you have an aggressive risk management and risk mitigation plans, there will always be security gaps. It's impossible to have systems 100% secure 100% of the time. And one of my old risk management teachers told me that if you have something 100% secured, then you're probably 0% operational. And so defense in depth is a security practice that adds multiple layers of protection. These multiple layers overlap with one another. Even if a gap occurs in one layer, there is a greater chance that a system is protected from another layer. So for an example, antivirus protection often uses a three-pronged approach. You install the antivirus at the firewall to scan incoming data. You also install antivirus software on the email servers to scan for malicious attachments or scripts. As a third measure, you install the antivirus software on all workstations and servers. So if something slips through the firewall, something slips through the email, you're hoping and making a bet that or you're relying on that third one, which is on the antivirus software on all workstations and servers. So that's your third and final defense. So you might wonder why you should install antivirus software on desktop systems if the firewall and email systems already scan for malware. Well, the reason is because users could transmit a virus from a CD, DVD, or USB flash drive. So, in other words, those are local to the machine, so they're inputting local to the machine and not accessing the network. So you would want your local machine, to actually be able to handle that. So in addition, although the antivirus software protects desktop systems, you still need additional antivirus software to scan email attachments. So malware is most commonly sent through email. And so if you haven't installed antivirus software on an email server, it will forward basically malware to the systems. And so basically, if a single system isn't up to date or has the malfunction or has a malfunction basically with the antivirus software, it will be infected. So this infection could quickly spread. So defense in depth is more expensive in the short run. However, defense in depth closes more security gaps in the long run, and it saves money. So that's what I used to tell my clients and customers when they develop their products. The problem when I first started with the equipment is that they had commercial off-the-shelf products. We called it COTS. And so they would just go buy any willy-nilly like Netgear routers and and left the default passwords and all that stuff in there. Well, that wasn't going to cut it with me. So they had to go through the DoD approved list of certified products. And so by doing that, we know that these systems have been tested and government approved in certain laboratories and been scrutinized by several different testers and whatnot. So they went from Netgear routers to Cisco or Juniper. I know those were the two that we could use, and we also used line of sight radios. Basically, if it was a line of sight and you could see 15 miles, then you have a signal. And so we would use the line of sight radios, Motorola. And so those also had to meet certain types of encryption, type 2 encryption, which would carry confidential data, but nothing classified. So it was basically a type 2 radio, type 2 encryption. Anyway, they were the people developing the products. Yes, it was easy to get the commercial off-the-shelf products. From Best Buy or Target or whatever, and have your product perform the way it needs to. However, it did not meet anywhere close to the defense in depth or wouldn't pass any legitimate risk assessment test. So that's why it would, from that point on, when I started implementing procedures and policies that you shall by Cisco or the DoD approved list. And so once that happened, the cost went up tremendously. However, our systems were more secure from the beginning. So instead of putting security on the tail end after the product is developed, which will cost you more in the long run, and I think you're less secure. So when you're developing the product and starting the product, it needs to be at the very front. And so that'll keep your information security gap to a minimum. And so again, that relies on your risk assessment, the snapshot in time. So now that we beat that to death, let's move on to another topic. So identifying the critical business functions. The critical business functions are, bear with me just a moment here. So identifying your critical business function, the CBFs is what the abbreviation is there. And a lot of times you'll see the critical success factors. We'll see that here shortly with the other slides that are coming up. So basically, a critical business function is any function considered vital to an organization. I mean, that's sort of self-explanatory and common sense. So if the critical business function fails, the organization will lose the ability to perform essential functions. So there you have it. It's pretty much common sense. So, and I had my old risk management instructor told me that, he said, Darren, he said risk management is it's all about functionality. And so if your systems are down and you can't perform the business, then you need a new risk management plan, obviously. So as you see on the slide here, you have the customer, you have the internet, there's the web server, the database server. So the customer is accessing the internet, and so we'll use eBay as an example. So the customer is going through the internet. They've connected to eBay, which they have their many thousands of web servers. And so let's say you connect to one of them and say you're looking for a car part. Let's just say a spark plug for whatever reason. And so it would access the web server. You type in your search for a spark plug, and then it activates the database server. It's like, okay, well, here's the list of spark plugs that we have. And this buyer has it, this seller has it. And so all of that data is sent back to the customer, and that way you can view it on the screen. And so that's basically, so if anything in here goes down between the customer and the web server, then eBay, or whichever company you choose, insert that in the blank, whether it's Walmart.com, Target.com, whatever, choose a company. If the web server is down, that means this person is going elsewhere. And we talked about in the first chapter, you want to keep your existing customers. You have them there, so you want your products up and going, and you want them to be able to view them. And so without that, I know if I'm looking for something and I said, this site's temporarily unavailable, sorry for the inconvenience, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's type in Amazon and see what they have, or let's go to Walmart.com or AutoZone. Since we're looking for spark plugs, let's throw that in there. So you see how the criticality of that is the internet, the connection between the customer and to the site is critical. And so basically, if the organizations cannot perform the function, it will lose money. And that's going back and reiterating the very first chapter that we talked about in the first lecture, was if they can't perform the job, or if they can't perform the function, they'll lose money. And so basically the loss could be due to the lost revenue or indirect losses. So the critical business function here, so let's identify this, let's walk it step by step. So the critical business function is making the purchase, right? So we want to make a purchase, and so you have internet access, that's one function. And then basically the web server has reliable internet access. And then if the internet access fails, the customer can't access the web server. So we talked about if it's down, then the customer's probably going to go somewhere else. So the web server availability, a lot of people don't think about this. They say, well, the server's up, but is it functioning properly? And so the web server must be operational. This includes the web server and the web application. If the web server fails, the customer can't complete the purchase. Now, the database server availability. A database server records the transaction. This includes details on the customer, the product purchased, the payment information. If the database server fails, the web application cannot complete the transaction. So basically, the critical function here can be in three different places: the internet access, the web server availability, and the database server availability. So if we're working backwards here, let's say the database server availability, let's say the database is down. It can't record the transactions, it can't make the transaction. So it doesn't matter if the web server's up or not. You like the product, but you can't buy it. You can see it, you can tell what the price is, but you click on it, add it to the cart, well, it's unavailable because the database server is down. And that's the one that controls all of the critical functions of the purchase. The product purchase, the payment information, details on the customer. So let's go on to the next slide here. Okay, So identifying the critical business functions continued. So let's talk about receiving funds. And this will So if a payment is received, although payment processing will often occur as a part of the transaction, it's separated, basically for clarity here. So let's say the credit card transactions are common on the internet. I've done it several times, and I'm sure you guys have as well. It's just easier to get online and order it, and it's here the next couple of days. It saves you a trip out to Walmart or Target or the grocery store or whatever. So the organization must comply with the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, which is PCI DSS, to process credit card payments. The web application uses data in the database to identify details for the credit card payment. It then sends a request to the appropriate bank for payment. So this step requires the same critical business functions as the purchase step. However, one additional element is needed. The PCI DSS compliance is required. So you see how they have implemented that control, and that's something that is a requirement, so you can't get past it if you want one of the major credit cards, or if you're accepting one of the major credit cards. They will have the PCI DSS compliance, and you must be up to par with them. And so must your servers and your applications meet the PCI DSS compliance. So basically, this ensures the organization is meeting minimum security standards for the credit card data. If the organization is not compliant with PCI DSS, it can lose the ability to process credit cards. So non-compliance can also result in fines. And I don't think anybody wants to be fined for that, right? So let's talk about the critical business functions of shipping your product. So as you can see, here's the customer, there's the shipping of the product, and there's the warehouse where it's located, the warehouse application server, the database server. It's sort of the same scenario as when you're purchasing something. So let's talk about the critical functions of shipping the product. So basically the figure that you're looking at on the screen, shows the last step in the process. And this step, workers use warehouse application to identify products to ship. The application interacts with a database server. The database server has details on purchased products, customers, and product locations. So the warehouse workers then ship the product to the customer. This step has several additional critical functions. So one, your warehouse application server, as you see there, your database server, your workers, your warehouse. And so the warehouse application server, this application must be available to the workers. It must also be able to interact with the database server. If the application is not available, the workers won't be able to identify products to ship. So the shipping will stop, making the customer very unhappy, and the company possibly having to issue a refund, or if you charge for shipping, then you have to refund the shipping as part of good customer service to honor that to keep that customer's business, and you want to keep them on board. As we mentioned before, existing customers are better to hang on to than going out and finding new customers. So the database server is needed to identify what products to ship. It also identifies details on where to ship it. And that would kind of help. It's like, okay, yeah, this person wants to ship, but they don't have an address. Well, most applications, or if you go in to buy a product, and you have your billing address, and then you have your shipping address. A lot of people have that little box that says same as the shipping address or billing address. But you have to have a shipping address. And so the database server retrieves all that information. And so if the data from the server is not available, shipping will stop. making the customer very unhappy. So you have your workers. The workers pack and ship the purchased products. They use the warehouse application server to identify the materials. If the workers aren't available, shipping stops, making customer unhappy. Even if an organization has been able to automate some of their functions, such as retrieving products, workers still finalize the process. Additionally, human interaction is valuable for quality control. You don't want to ship somebody a broken remote control car or broken iPad, something like that, so making customer very unhappy. Imagine if you ordered overnight shipping, paid $60 to get it there, and the product that you have is broken, and so, or the product you received is broken. Very unhappy customer. So the warehouse, the products are stored and shipped from the warehouse. If the warehouse is damaged, two things are affected. First, the inventory may be lost. For example, a fire could destroy some or all of the inventory in the warehouse. Secondly, shipping may stop or be slowed. If the shipping area is damaged, shipping may stop completely. If products are damaged, shipping will be delayed for these products, making customer unhappy. In other words, going somewhere else, you've lost a customer. So basically the warehouse database server, just a small tip here, holds a lot of the same data as the web database server. However, it will probably be a little bit different server. The servers have different availability needs. So the web application needs to be operational all the time. So the warehouse application needs to be available only when workers are shipping goods. Automation techniques would regularly move data from the web database server to the warehouse database server. And so with the critical business functions identified, you now can focus on your risk. I know that's a lot of steps to go through just to focus on risk, right? So each of these functions can be reviewed to basically ensure that adequate steps are taken to protect them. So if you notice that some of the functions will require different levels of protection. For example, the web server and the web database server need to be operational all the time. So for example, the web server and the web database server need to be operational all the time. Which means the maximum acceptable outage needs to be at a minimum. So you want to make sure that the maximum available outage is very short. So the servers may require failover clusters to ensure the services continue to run even if the server fails. However, shipping may only occur 6 days a week during the daytime. So the warehouse servers won't need the same level of protection. So the MAO maximum so the MAO for these servers is significantly longer. So let's talk about our favorite topic here. I told you that this would be one thing that you would not be able to escape, and that's the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. These are crucial. You can basically go all the way back to chapter 1, but you can also review it here. So basically what I want you to do, or what you need to do, is go back and review the 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure and identify the risk. By looking at each of these domains, you can identify the scope of risk management needed for your organization. So basically the diagram on your screen, the 7 risks within the 7 domains, compares so let's look at the user domain. We've already talked about this. where basically the computers by themselves do a lot, and they can't do anything by themselves. So instead, the computers are here to support the users. And so, with this in mind, it's important to look at risk associated with users. The primary risk associated with the user domain are related to social engineering. We talked about that in the first chapter. Users can be conned and tricked, which means they've given up the passwords or critical data. A social engineer tries to trick a user into giving up information or performing an unsafe action. You basically combat these risks by raising user awareness, user training, installing acceptable use policies. Basically they help ensure users know what they should be looking for, what they should and should not be doing. Log-on banners to remind the users of the AUP that they signed and said, okay, you work for this company, here's what we expect of you when you log on this computer, blah, 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 blah. And you click OK and it goes to your login screen. By clicking OK, you've actually agreed to the policies there. Basically organizations can send out occasional emails with security tidbits and tips to keep security awareness on the user's minds. Posters in employee areas are also help awareness. The workstation domain, basically is the computers that users will use. In some organizations, all employees have computers on their desk. In other organizations, desktop computers may be limited. For example, not every user in a warehouse needs a computer. However, when users do have computers, they face risk. Some of the primary risks associated with the workstations are related to malware. Users can bring malware from home on universal serial bus flash drives. They can accidentally download malware from web servers or websites, and they can install malware from malicious emails. So the primary protection is to ensure that you install antivirus software at the 3 levels that we talked about. But now we're talking about the workstation domain, so that would actually be applied to the workstation itself. That would be the 3rd layer of defense in depth. You must also be sure to keep operating systems up to date with security patches when they become available. Just as you can use tools to ensure antivirus software remains updated, you can also use tools to keep the systems patched. So let's move on to the LAN domain. The LAN domain includes the networking components that connect systems on a local area network. So all the machines in your office that you might have access to. Hardware components such as routers and switches. It also includes the wiring and wiring closets and to connect to the users. Used to connect all the users. So computers typically access network resources via the servers. For example, in a Microsoft environment, clients are connected in a Microsoft domain. This includes at least one server acting as a domain controller. In a Microsoft domain, every user must have an account to log on to the domain. Moreover, every computer must have an account on the domain. So not only do you have to have a user account, your computer also has to be within the Active Directory account and recognized through the Active Directory. So basically in the old days what we used to do, and you still do it, is you take the machine and join that to the domain. It takes the system's administrator or administrator rights or above, or the granted special users access rights. A technician can join to a domain through special permissions, and that way they can join that computer to the domain, and then if a person has a user account, they can log on to the machine that has the domain account or the domain actually has been submitted to the domain or join the domain. There's also there's port security as an added control. So basically, let's say my network port goes down and you can't just take your laptop and move to the person next door to you in the other cube or the next office and plug into their port. So basically that ensures that that computer, that MAC address belongs to this port. And so that keeps outside people from coming in and hooking into just any port. They would have to have access, based on their need to know or whatnot. So port security is good. So the LAN-to-WAN domain, basically marks the boundary where the private network meets the public network. And in this context, basically the public network is internet. So many different types of attacks come from the internet. The primary protection here is the use of one or more firewalls. So firewalls can examine traffic as it passes through and allow or block traffic based on rules. So although most organizations have firewalls in place, the major concern here is the management of the firewalls. A common problem is too many firewall rules allowing too much traffic. So the firewall should discriminate and allow only certain types of traffic. So organizations commonly use hardware firewalls that can be very sophisticated. Administrators often need additional training to ensure they know how to manage and maintain them. So trained administrators understand the importance of limiting the number of firewall rules. You don't want to shut everything down, then it makes the boss mad because they can't check the weather or set up their next tea time, right? So the WAN domain. This includes all systems that are accessible over the wide area network. This primarily refers to servers accessible over the internet. Servers are available on the internet have basically a public IP address. They can be reached from any system on the internet. This makes them easy targets. So a primary method of protection for systems in the WAN domain is the use of a demilitarized zone known as a DMZ. D as in Delta, M as in Mike, Z as in Zulu, DMZ. A DMZ uses two firewalls. One firewall has direct access to the internet. The other firewall has direct access to the internal network. The area between the two firewalls is the DMZ. So although the DMZ doesn't stop basically an attacker from accessing a server, it can limit the attacker's access. For example, a web server can be placed in the DMZ to host a website. So web servers use the HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So secure web servers also use the Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, HTTPS. The well-known ports for HTTP and HTTPS is 80 and 443 respectively. You configure the DMZ to allow traffic to the web server using only port 80 and 443. All other traffic directed at the web server is blocked. Additionally, these servers need to be kept up to date. Security patches released, and you should evaluate them as soon as possible and make sure that they don't kill your production servers, and make sure the patch is installed correctly on a non-production web server. The remote domain access. Wow. That allows remote users to access the private network. Many of them access through the VPN, which is a virtual private network, and that allows a user to access the private network over a public network such as the internet. So if the organization utilizes remote access servers, you need to consider the risk. If you're using dial-in remote access servers, we call that the RAS servers, your systems are available from any phone. The attacker only needs to know the phone number. So if you're using a VPN servers, the VPN server has an IP address, and that is publicly available from anywhere on the internet. So if you go on travel TDY to whatever city and you're in whatever hotel, you connect to their Wi-Fi, well, you connect to your VPN, well, you're on a public IP address. And so you can use different controls to protect servers within the remote access domain. So the old method of the automatic callback is one method used with dial-in remote access servers. So let's say that little Johnny can work from home. His account information includes his phone number, when he dials in, when he's prompted to log on, and as soon as he logs on, the remote server hangs up and calls him at home. So basically this increases the security, because even if an attacker learns little Johnny's credentials, the attacker can't use them for remote access. So if the attacker dials in and logs on with little Johnny's credentials, the server hangs up and basically calls Johnny at home. So remote access policies are another control used with remote access. So policies are used to specify several conditions to ensure the connection is secure. For example, a policy could specify that only layer 2 tunneling protection L2TP connections are allowed. So basically the Internet Protocol Security, IPsec, could be required to encrypt the connection. So let's move into the system domain. The system domain, or the application domain. And so the system application domain includes any server-based applications. This can include email servers, it can include database servers, it can include any server system that has dedicated application. So for example, Oracle Database hosts database on a server, Microsoft Exchange is a popular email server, Apache hosts web applications on web servers. Each of these applications is specialized, so they have unique risk. They often require specialized knowledge to manage and configure. So, basically, additionally, they require attention to detail to keep them secure. So, a primary requirement to keep these systems secure is to ensure administrators have adequate training and knowledge, and they need to know the configuration and change management practices. That's always helpful. So configuration management ensures the systems are configured using sound security practices. So change management ensures that the configuration is not modified without adequate review. And so that way everybody knows what's happening, and it goes up the chain for approval. So basically system applications often have bugs. Vendors release security patches when they're identified in the bugs, and administrators install them. And so when systems are not up to date, the software sends alerts to administrators. In some organizations, the network access control software isolates updated patches. These systems have limited network access until they are up to date. Understanding and accessing the impact of legal and compliance issues. And I know this is something that none of us want to deal with. That's why the companies hire lawyers, right? Compliance is a mitigation control. So if there's a compliance that it's a best practice that needs to be implemented, then by all means implement that. Assessing the impact of compliance issues. Identify what compliance issues apply to your organization. And so you also want to assess impact of issues on business operations. For instance, HIPAA, SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX, Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, Children's Internet Protection, SEPA, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS. So basically, STIPA requires a TPM. Well, what's a TPM? That's a technical protection, or excuse me, a technology protection measure. Basically a proxy server uses a technology protection measure. A proxy server, basically receives requests from clients for web pages, retrieves the web pages, and then the server then serves the pages to the clients. If it can also filter the request to block content request. Users are also able to use internet through the proxy server. All content requests are filtered using the content filter. If the content is acceptable, the page is retrieved and sent to the client. So if the content is unacceptable, the content's blocked. As you can see in the diagram on the screen, and basically other laws may require other controls. As you can see the process here, basically here the end users, they get a result of unacceptable or acceptable. Acceptable traffic you're able to view, and unacceptable, obviously is blocked. So I'm not going to spend any more time on these. We've already gone through a lot of these. So, basically assessing how security measures, safeguards can assist with risk mitigation. Controls are implemented at a point in time, as we talk about risk assessment, to reduce the risk at that time. A control will attempt to mitigate risk, by reducing the impact of the threat to an acceptable level, reducing a vulnerability to an acceptable level. And so the risk assessment is a point in time assessment, as we mentioned earlier. It's basically a snapshot. Here's another picture of the compliances that are popular. When you're identifying your risk mitigation and risk reduction elements, your account management controls, access controls, physical access, all of these play an important part in the risk assessment and plan. And so, and then here comes our performing a cost-benefit analysis. Basically you're comparing the cost of control to cost of risk if it occurs, and you're calculating projected benefits. The loss before control minus the loss after control equals the projected benefits. So determining if the control should be used, so it's projected benefits minus the cost of control equals the control value. Risk mitigation best practices. Basically review historical documentation, as we mentioned in earlier chapters. Although risks change, many of the threats and vulnerabilities will be the same. So basically you want to include both a narrow and broad focus, identify specific risk and mitigation strategies, and broaden the focus to include the entire organization. You don't want to just isolate one specific office, although each department may have their own specialization and their own focus, but it all comes under the same plan in the end. You want to make sure that you're obeying all the compliance, depending if you're a health organization, your HIPAA. If you're a school, then you're wanting to identify with FERPA. If you're a credit card organization, or if you're dealing with credit cards, you want to deal with PCI DSS. And so you want to do it, basically when a risk assessment, when a control changes, you want to redo the risk assessment. So if a control changes, the original risk assessment is no longer valid. So I know in the DoD we used to do quarterly, but now they're doing continuous monitoring. And so that way they have a better chance of see when the control changes, they're already on top of it. So include the cost-benefit analysis. It basically provides justification for controls and help determine their value. And so with that being said, let's go into chapter 11, and we'll go through this real quickly. I don't want to beat a dead horse here. But Chapter 11 is going to reiterate a lot of what Chapter 10 was talking about. Chapter 10 kind of gives you the foundational basis, and Chapter 11 just sort of goes a little bit deeper into the process, because when you're creating a risk management plan, we've already talked about creating a risk assessment. We want to identify the cost benefit analysis, and then you want to implement the plan, obviously. You want to give it like a 10,000 view level. The figure of speech is, a 10,000 feet view is high level review of risk assessment. You want to identify and evaluate relevant threats, identify and evaluate relevant vulnerabilities, identify and evaluate countermeasures, and develop mitigating recommendations. Calculating the cost. Your initial purchase, your facility, your installation, your training. And so, basically look for the hidden cost. Is extra power required to eliminate a single point of failure? Those kind of things that you want to look for. Hidden cost is like, well, yeah, we have power to the building, but do you have adequate power to power these many servers? If you're having to hook up failover servers for your database servers, so that way if you have customers that are purchasing something and the main database goes down, then you need to have redundancy set up. Those are all good things. You've covered those basic critical business functions, but have you thought about extra power? Will you need another power grid? Will you need another transformer to power all these things? So that can be a cost in one of the risk assessment that you didn't see. So that's what they consider as a hidden cost. Simple configurations can be implemented in a short period of time. As we mentioned, there's your DMZ, your firewalls, your database web servers configured with antivirus software, those type things. So time to implement. Complex configurations, more planning and more time. Obviously, you see the web farm in this picture is using network load balancing, and then the other one is the failover cluster for database servers. Those are a little more complicated, and they're going to take a little more time to set up. The operational impact, there's trade-off with security. The more secure system, the harder it is to use. As I mentioned before, my risk management instructor at one time said, if it's 100% secure, then it's probably 0% operational. There's nothing wrong with getting it as secure as possible, but then you may lose some functionality, whether it's speed, processing time, whatever. The easier it is to use is the less secure it is. So you have to find the happy medium there, and what your management is willing to accept, risk acceptability there. So the firewall implicit deny philosophy. In other words, you're basically denying everything coming through. Prioritizing your risk elements, the threat vulnerability matrix that you've talked about in previous chapters, determine the likelihood, determine the impact, and then you want to prioritize your countermeasures. So, the high threat likelihood, you've seen this picture before, so I won't beat this to death, and it just a threat likelihood impact matrix. Performing a cost-benefit analysis, we've gone over this in Chapter 10, so I'm not going to, beat a dead horse here. So, it's pretty much the same things, but I don't believe we saw this on the last chapter. So, implementing a risk management plan, you want to stay within a budget. Upper management loves to stay within a budget, and it's all about the money, right? Until somebody's system's hacked and you're out millions of dollars because you let some information out or whatever. That's why security up front and Sometimes you want a very a liberal budget. Sometimes you want to overshoot your budget just in case you have those hidden costs that you didn't see before, like the extra power grids that would solidify and satisfy your other controls like failover, redundancy, and those kind of things. You want to use tools to manage your project. A lot of people use project management. Microsoft Project is a very powerful tool. Some people use Excel, and of course, Microsoft Project will implement these different databases and Excel worksheets and import them in, and you can create a project from there. And as you can see, stay on schedule, M1, M2, purchase the equipment, purchase servers and hardware, install the equipment bays, run newer power, add AC to the room, provide training to administrators. As you can see how this is project management can help you stay on track. And then you want to monitor the implementation, by using the the project management tools, and you can set milestones in there of okay, so our start date's going to be here, but by so and so time we want to purchase these equipment bays, and then after we purchase the equipment bays, we want to purchase the server hardware, and so you give specific timelines for that, and you want to meet those critical points. And being ahead of schedule is not a bad thing, because sometimes if you're ahead of schedule on some of these things here, if you fall behind here, then you find a happy medium within your project management, and you still meet the deadline. So you want to provide training to administrators. When we're going to do that, we're going to install and configure, and then, hey, by this day we're going to go live. And so that's what it means to stay on project, on time there. So implementation challenges, scope and cost overruns, stay within your budget. We've mentioned this several times. Ineffective countermeasures, basically make sure your countermeasures work as they're expected to. Have a follow-up on the risk management plan. Ensure countermeasures are implemented. A lot of people call this a POAM, not a poem, but a POAM, which is a plan of action and milestone. And this lets you, I can remember doing my first POAM as an information assurance manager, and I assure you, they're very detailed and they're very difficult to maintain. There's a lot of moving parts in there that you have to watch and make sure that you're maintaining, especially the security gaps, and make sure that those, as we talked about earlier, make sure those security gaps have been closed. Whether it's defense in depth or risk management framework or COBIT, we've talked about that in chapter 2 or lesson 2. So you want to stay within scope. You shouldn't go outside the scope. You set your scope. You just like driving a car, you're going down the road, you want to stay between the lines, right? Basically, your cost benefit analysis, you need to redo one if something pops up, if new costs are identified. So and basically make sure your data is accurate, because you don't want to redo or reinvent the wheel, if you will. So then you want to prioritize your countermeasures, prioritize based on importance, and a lot of times that will come from upper management, and they will tell you, it's like, yeah, okay, let's focus on these areas first, and this is what we deem as upper management, this is what we deem as most important and what's critical, and so you prioritize on those. You want your most critical assets prioritized first. Basically the risk management best practices, basically this is self-explanatory. So, in closing, identifying the scope of risk management plan, the best practices, ways to prioritize risk management requirements, developing an organizational risk mitigation plan, and best practices for implementing a risk mitigation plan. And so, with that being said, that's the end of our lecture for lesson 5. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to email me. I know there's an issue with late assignments. This is a graduate level course. By now, you should be able to keep up with your assignments and time management. I know the first 2 or 3 weeks I was very lenient because some people did not have their access codes to access the material. But going forward, there's no late assignments unless you have prior approval from me. Based on legitimate excuses. A lot of times, if it's a doctor's excuse, then I want you to provide paperwork. So, going forward, let's keep those assignments up to date. There's a lot of you that I've noticed on your that you're actually completing your quizzes before you actually complete the labs, and then your quiz grades are low. And so that tells me you need to be doing the reading, you need to do the labs, then you need to do the assessment, the quiz. That way your quiz scores, the quiz score should be a give me grade because you've done your reading and you've done the labs. So, but if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me or contact me. I hope you have fun with this lesson. Risk assessments have a lot of moving pieces, a lot of moving parts, but they can be fun. And hopefully after, these chapters and going through this book, you'd be able to help any organization go through any risk assessment and implement a risk management plan. So with that being said, you guys have a good day, good week, and if you need me, please give me a shout out.